So this is the book, Black Skyscraper, Architecture and the Perception of Race. I don't have to tell anyone in this room, in this virtual room, that the skyscraper has received plenty of scholarly attention in its century and a half of its existence. And this is just a slide that pays homage to not even all of the books, but many of the books that I definitely read and helped shape my thinking about the skyscraper, listed here. As you all know, again, that the skyscraper has been thought about in relationship to just about everything: capitalism, gender, engineering, construction, economics, facade design, the fine arts, cinema, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, trying to figure out a way to say something new or interesting or different was certainly a daunting task. And Black Skyscraper was my attempt to tell a story that it took me a while to really uncover and think through. And I'm going to tell a little bit of the story behind the story as part of this talk. But let me first start by giving you kind of the thesis of the book in a kind of a nutshell. That my book insists that by looking at writing about the early skyscraper during the first few decades of its invention, writing not just by fiction writers, but by journalists, theorists, thinkers, public figures, and architects themselves, we get a new story about the skyscraper as a fount of racial anxiety, but also a site for experimentation regarding this architecture's impact on how race was both perceived and felt. So before I go into more depth about the book, maybe a quick setup about how I got here, how me and English PhD wrote a book about architecture, about skyscraper and race. So I was always interested in the relationship between architecture and race. As an undergraduate, I was an English major, but really more working in American studies and thinking interdisciplinarily. And that's what I thought I was going to kind of write my dissertation about. So I did my qualifying exams. I did two lists, one list on American literature, largely 20th century, and I did another list on American architectural and urban theory. And I was interested in the way these lists were going to speak to one another, but just as interested in the impasses between those two different ways of thinking about a national art, right? And how to tell a story of a nation through literature and through building. And so what I noticed on the architectural side, and I think what this partial bibliography suggests or backs up, is that, you know, you can't really tell the story, or people haven't told the story of American architecture without centering the skyscraper, right, as an important structure for many different, for cultural reasons, for structural reasons, for national reasons, right? That, you know, you'd be hard pressed to tell that history without talking about the skyscraper. And for good reason. And what I started to grow very interested in, okay, I want to go this way, there we go, is trying to recover the perceptual story of the skyscraper and the lived experience of what it meant to be witnessing the change that the skyscraper wrought upon the American city in real time, whether it's in person, right, as a resident of New York or Chicago, but also through the kind of vast media story that the skyscraper also was a catalyst for. So I'll talk a little bit about both of those things. And this is just a quick example. Again, will be no surprise to anyone in this room, but the perceptual and spatial changes the skyscraper wrought upon the city and its residents were undoubtedly extreme. From the erection of something like the 10-story Rand McNally building in Chicago in 1889, with 10 stories being about, you know, what you were going to get in that period in the late 1880s or early 1890s for a tall building in an urban center, to the 41-story Singer building in 1908, the height of the tallest building more than quadrupled in a single generation. With the completion of Empire State in 1931, this number would further increase by a factor of 2.5. By 1929, America had 377 buildings exceeding 20 stories, with 188 of those standing in New York alone. So again, while these stats I think are nothing new to this crowd, what I was trying to recover, what I ended up trying to recover in this project as a start, was the kind of sensory and perceptual experience of this shift. Trying to understand the various forms of perceptual stress, but also liberatory potential that writers, architects, thinkers, journalists described experiencing and built environments whose scales were changing at a radical clip. And for many Americans, these massive changes to the look and scale of the city occurred within just half a lifetime. As builder William Sterrett wondered in 1928, Carol and I just had a lovely conversation about Sterrett, and both of us are fans of his book, Skyscrapers and the Men Who Build Them. This is a quote from that book. He says, quote, "Who can look on the majestic skyline of New York in sunshine or shadow and not be moved, both by the tremendous power of its mass and the beauty and richness of its detail? Yet, if you are 43 years or more old, your eyes have seen it all." And there's something about that quote. I've returned to it a lot in various stages of this project, right? What does it mean for your eyes to have seen it all at 43, to feel like you've seen the world change around you, right? Or at least the kind of scale of the world change around you, and try to recapture that experience. Even for those residing outside this architecture's primarily northern and urban domain, its presence in large skyscraper was a frequent topic of mass culture. Stories, cartoons, and photographs of this architecture regularly appeared in magazines and newspapers circulating outside urban centers. Despite their association with cities, skyscrapers were predominantly referred to within the public sphere as products of the entire nation, touted as, quote, "the most distinctively American thing in the world," quote, "all American in all hours and conception," and, quote, "the only indigenous architectural product to which we lay claim." So that kind of national claim around the skyscraper is really interesting to me, to be able to kind of claim the ways that the skyscraper was kind of mediating nationhood, whether you were in New York or Chicago or not. Given the astonishing speed of the US's transformation from Jeffersonian agrarianism to urban industrialism, with the urban population outnumbering the rural for the first time in the nation's history in the 1910s, the skyscraper was part of the immediate and mediated lives of an increasing number of Americans. So this is the story that I was gathering, beginning on that original qualifying exams list, but very much built out from the work and scholarship of many of you in this room who've written so beautifully about the skyscraper. And so what I was finding on my literature list was a little bit different and kind of surprising, and it's the impasse that kind of generated the dissertation that would generate the book. So when you close your eyes and think about the early skyscraper, it's not likely that it's a novelistic representation that's going to pop into your mind. Maybe something like King Kong, maybe something like the film of the Fountainhead, perhaps, the work of O'Keeffe and Steichen, or if you're thinking about painting and photography, Lewis Hines's iconic images of men at work. Maybe you think about Cole Porter and his musical odes to the skyscraper. These famous images of architects at the Beaux-Arts Ball. And I want to give a shout out to Meryl Schleier's book on cinema and the skyscraper, which is really important to my thinking as well. But when you turn to the kind of iconic novels of American modernism, the skyscraper has a kind of a more unstable representational story to tell here. I mean, probably the two novels, the most famous novels that we probably still know of today that really paid significant attention to the skyscraper are The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, a novel that's a little bit later than the period I'm looking at. So I don't talk about it in the book. And then The Cliff Dweller by Henry Fuller, which we don't read so much today, but which was really kind of a important realist novel in the late 19th century, where the skyscraper really does feature substantially in the book, and it gives the novel its name, The Cliff Dwellers. But if you look at many of the kind of iconic novels from American modernism, the skyscraper really gets a line or two of attention is kind of gone. So in something like The Great Gatsby, for instance, the most direct representation you get of a skyscraper is when Nick and Gatsby are driving into the city, and Fitzgerald describes skyscrapers as the skyline as white heaps and sugar lumps. And that's it. I argue in my book that this skyscraper is doing other kind of work to set the scene and to set up the ways that people see and relate to each other in the city. But in terms of kind of direct mimetic representation, there isn't much. The same is true for a work like John Dos Passos's USA trilogy, a massive set of books that really tried to be the great American novel. And you can tell from its title. Dos Passos trained for a summer as an architect, sketching. He writes a lot about the skyscraper in his earlier novel, Manhattan Transfer. But by the time he gets to the USA trilogy, he talked about skyscrapers once as pale blinking structures and clean silver rods, and they're gone. The same is true of a work like Native Son and The Jungle. I write a bit about Henry James, who has a short story called The Jolly Corner, which takes up the skyscraper. And he really is probably most known for lambasting the skyscraper in his series of essays, The American Scene, where after returning to New York after decades away in Europe, he kind of comes back to a changed New York, and at first has this really interesting flirtation with skyscraper architecture and is enchanted by it, but quickly turns his back on it and describes it. He describes the skyline as a pincushion, as a toothless comb, and really kind of thinks about the skyscraper as an enemy of history and an enemy of intimacy. So it's really, you could bring up many more novels here: Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Call It Sleep, House of Mirth. The skyscraper really is not of interest to a lot of novelists. So this is where the kind of spark for this project began. It's like trying to understand the impasse between these two qualifying exam lists that I had made. Why is the skyscraper, I know why the skyscraper is at the center of American architecture, but why is the novel so disinterested in it? And I set out to try to answer that question for my dissertation, to tell a new story about the literature of American modernism by way of its encounters with architectural upheavals as each of these phenomena work to reshape the nation. And so that was the project. I started to then branch out from the kind of big famous novels of American modernism and really then try to see what's going on in genre fiction. And a different story happens in genre fiction once you turn to science fiction, to labor fiction, to romance, to print culture more broadly. The skyscraper is everywhere. It's really saturates the scene of print culture. And that genre writers are using the skyscraper to work through a lot of questions about how to see, what to look at, how science fiction was trying to out imagine the skyscraper, which itself was putting such pressure. It was changing the perceptual norms within the city so quickly. In some ways, it feels like the science fiction is trying to catch up to the skyscraper rather than vice versa. And so this was the project, is to really try to tell this kind of story about the literary, and particularly the literary story of the skyscraper, rather than the kind of broader cultural story, than the kind of the story of the skyscraper in prose. How do you wrap your head around telling a story about a structure that seems to swallow the individual, right, and make intimacy and social relationships more difficult, right? That the skyscraper architecture is a real foil for narrative, right? And that's the story I started to tell. So that was well and nice. I wrote my dissertation. And then I got a job at the University of Chicago and moved to Chicago. And so just having a kind of different, immediate relationship to the landscape of Chicago was, I think, really did shape this project in tangible and intangible ways. But also I had time to really revisit my archives and slow down. I had written a chapter in the dissertation that was about Black writers and their relationship to the skyscraper. Had discovered this unpublished W.B. Du Bois story, The Princess Steel, or he's writing science fiction about the skyscraper at the turn of the 20th century. And so race was important to me in the dissertation. But when I went back and started to think about how to make this into a book, I noticed something different that I hadn't really seen when I was thinking about this as a dissertation. I went back to these kind of familiar cultural archives of the skyscraper that I had been working with, as well as the kind of lesser known manifestations in genre writing. The intimacy between architecture and literature was continually framed by a third factor: concerns or observations or quiet observations, sometimes quiet, sometimes quite loud, about racial perception that were persistently shadowing the shape and stakes of the way that the skyscraper was appearing in print. I realized that a lot of the times that I was seeing the skyscraper, it was typically connected to the act of either racial sight, seeing racial others, or understanding oneself as a race subject. And that this was all taking place in cities where what it meant to see was undergoing a rapid change due to the density, fragmented sightlines, and the changing scale wrought and contributed to by the skyscraper. And that's where the Black Skyscraper really emerges, to tell this story about the ways that the skyscraper appears in turn of the century narratives as a radical reformer of the perceptual experience of race. And this is both in relationship to sight and other kinds of sensory experience, thinking about the difficulties or the stresses that the skyscraper will put and place on the ability to have, or to on the strain that the skyscraper put on the ability to discern others by their race. So for instance, from the top of the skyscraper, a view that many writers were enamored with, as well as visual artists, right? The writers kind of obsessively try to figure out how to describe people, what they look like at the base of the skyscraper, and from buildings that are growing increasingly taller over time, get lots of analogies, none that will surprise you, I don't think, to specks, to ants, to bees, often dark specks, dark ants, and dark bees. And what's interesting to me is, again, this interest or this fascination with a vision of American of people, right? Where it's difficult to make a racial judgment, and the awareness that the idea of racial difference is really dependent on perception and scale, and at what scale can you make a racial observation, right? At what scale is race a useful categorizing tool for people, and at what scale does race fail to work, right? A kind of in some ways, like a very simple question, a very mechanical, corporeal question, right? But one I think that often gets overlooked when we're thinking about understandings of racial perception, right? The ways that volume and scale play a role in how people imagine that race could work or couldn't work. So that's true from the top of the skyscraper, but also at the base, where the new density that the skyscraper is helping to facilitate, as well as the kind of increasing numbers of race of others, of people in general in urban cities in the late 19th and early 20th century, with both migration internal to the U.S., but also, of course, immigration outside of the U.S. That distortion of the racial sign was also happening on the street, right? Where the ability to be sure that one could read others racially, right, was being tested and really stretched and made to be thought of as perhaps less empirical than one might have thought in this period where racial science was also, a real player on the scene. So not only was the ability to read race seemingly jeopardized by this architecture, but also the capacity to feel race, as white authors in particular describe feeling less like self-sovereign white agents in the skyscraper shadow and more like mechanized automatons or even chattel slaves. When you get particularly into the Jazz Age writing, right, by writers like Fitzgerald and others, right, this idea of what was the white metropolitan going to be able to be an enduring category? What was going to happen to white metropolitan identity in a city where it was hard to know what you were seeing when you were looking at a body, and how the skyscraper, contributed to those questions. So whereas some writers, including a few key Harlem Renaissance figures like Du Bois and Wallace Thurman, and I write a little bit about Aaron Douglas as well, embrace these disorienting conditions, contemplating the liberating possibilities of the skyscraper's distortion of race, many others expressed dread in the face of this architecture that seemed to narrow the perceivable gap between the urban subject and the ethnic subject, affecting the ability to know oneself as a race subject. The early skyscraper appears in prose from this era as a disruptive force poised to unmake race from the inside out. So my book recovers the early skyscraper's influence not just on the shape of the city, but the racial sensorium of its residents and readers. The skyscraper, I argue, posed a challenge to older systems of racial perception and its hierarchies, causing American writers across a number of print genres to newly wonder how bodies would continue to appear and be understood as raced, prompting writer Henry James to put the verb seeing itself in quotation marks when faced with its overwhelming size. The skyscraper's earliest appearances in print foreground the malleable nature of racial perception, posing a direct challenge to the nation's concurrent desires in the era of Jim Crow to stabilize and thus reject the conditionality of the perceiving faculties. So my book considers a diverse print range print archive ranging from Gilded Age realist novels to Jazz Age melodramas to recover the kinetic conversations between race, architecture, and writing. Okay, so that's like the broad strokes of the book. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about the racial context in which the skyscraper does this work. While I'm certainly interested in thinking about the ways that the skyscraper is always, and architecture more broadly, is always shaping and mediating race, which I'm going to come back to in a little bit. The argument that I'm making is really about the early skyscraper for a number of reasons. In the epilogue, I talk a little bit about contemporary skyscrapers and the way that race is still playing a role, the way that contemporary skyscraper is still playing a role in the way that race is seen and understood. But the project is really about the early skyscraper and for me, I date that from the invention in the 1880s and 1890s to 1930, really 1931 in Empire State. And this is really because in this period, racial definitions and categories were really intensely in flux. And there were competing definitions across different spheres and regions. And that's the story I really want to tease out because it is really important to this book, that the early skyscraper can play this catalytic role in relationship to race, in part because of the historical context surrounding it, in relationship to questions about where race was, where it resided in the body, and how to read it. So notions about what race was, where it resided, and how to read it were all in major flux after Reconstruction. The skyscraper, in helping to obfuscate seeing and thusly knowing within American cities, highlighted the competing definitions of race that existed across the nation during this period. So throughout much of the South, race had historically been a matter of ancestry. Part of Jim Crow's formal institutionalization at the turn of the century involved a slew of new legislation designed to shore up a two-tiered system of racial segregation by way of blood. The one-drop rule, the assertion that a person with any degree of Black ancestry was classified as Black, had been the informal racial doctrine throughout much of the US for centuries prior, serving to ensure that the children of white owners and Black slaves remained property. Now, this was largely true throughout the South, though obviously there were exceptions, really in a place like Louisiana, right, where you had these different castes, right, or quadroons and octoroons. It wasn't just, one drop or not one drop. Though one could argue that fundamentally that was at play, but you still had these kind of different social categories. But for the most part, the one-drop rule was the kind of accepted way of thinking about race in order to maintain the institution of slavery. But before 1900, these rules were neither universal nor legal statute. Again, there was unevenness about the one-drop rule depending on where you were. But this starts to change really starting in 1901, where states really start to put one-drop rules on their books, right? Really ratify the one-drop rule as law, as part of the kind of growing organization around the regime of Jim Crow. With the legal institution of the one-drop rule in most Southern states during the early 20th century, the technical definition of Blackness in both the North and the South considerably narrowed. Virginia, just to give an example of this, Virginia changed its legal definition of Blackness in 1910 from a 1/8 measure, meaning a person with one Black grandparent was to be considered Black, to 1/16, which meant that legally rendered as Black anyone with a great-great-grandparent of African descent. And in 1930, the state dropped the pretense of fractional measurement altogether, stating that, quote, having any Negro blood at all qualified a person as Black in the eyes of the state, right? So sometimes, this is a kind of common story you'll see with one-drop rules. Like they'll start with the measurement will get more and more, will get smaller until they just say any drop of blood. And yeah, to have knowledge of a person's ancestry in such detail, right, to know that someone's great-great-great-grandparent is of African descent, required the possession of either a deep hereditary archive or a shared pool of colloquial knowledge. Both forms of knowing proved harder to come by in parts of the country to which people were moving in record numbers at the turn of the century, namely the Western frontier and the industrial North, right? So what good was the one-drop rule going to do you in New York, right? Where you didn't know who anyone's great-great-great-grandparent was, and you had waves of migrants and immigrants coming from other countries, producing and creating a situation where you're interacting with all different types of people, right? And in the US, before the 1920s, there's not really a strong difference between a racial determination and an ethnic determination, right? So the difference between a Czech and a Pole and a German, right, is largely a racial one, even if some of those figures are thought about under the category of whiteness or not. So it's a really messy racial story, right? Some people thought there were 3 racial categories according to the race science of the day, and some people argued that there were 63, right? So the one drop rule is not going to really help you that much. While the one drop in rule was in theory the dominant definition of race in the United States in both the North and the South in the early 20th century, the lack of ready ancestral information about new arrivals led visual determinations of race to predominate in places replete with large numbers of migrants and immigrants, right? So if blood can't really tell you anything, sight can, right? Perception and a visual determination of race comes to kind of rule the day. And yet, given centuries of miscegenation under slavery, as well as new types of racial difference accumulating with the US from abroad, determining race by sight proved just as difficult a challenge under even the most stable perceptual conditions. Within perceptually trying urban environments, hosting denser groups of people, higher collections of buildings, sorting whites from non-whites, or sorting anyone from anyone else, right? Any type from any other type was a growing problem as seeing proved harder to believe. And so I want to talk a little bit about these series of court cases in the early 20th century that foregrounded the contortions of blood and skin that courts in particular deployed to maintain an exclusionary definition of whiteness under these conditions. Whiteness frequently appeared in this period as an object of litigation within citizenship cases. A series of legislative acts starting in the 1870s limited naturalization to whites and those of African descent in order to restrict the numbers of people seeking American citizenship. So while you could immigrate to the US to naturalize, you had these racial constrictions. But the definition of whiteness for immigration purposes faced continual legal contestation, with 2 such cases reaching the Supreme Court. So the first is by Takuya Ozawa. I don't know if he's left on your screen, he's left on my screen, who was an immigrant from Japan who had lived in the US for 20 years before applying for citizenship in 1914 on the grounds that his skin was lighter than most white American citizens born here. So his argument was like, if we're going by a visual account of race, I'm whiter than anyone else visually on the Supreme Court. So I should qualify as white, and thusly I should be granted citizenship. The Supreme Court ruled against Ozawa in 1922 on the grounds that, quote, the test afforded by the mere color of the skin of each individual is impracticable, given, quote, the imperceptible gradations even among Anglo-Saxons. Okay, so Ozawa's ruled against. A few months later, the Supreme Court would also rule against Bhagat Singh Thind, who's the other gentleman right here, a Sikh man who's also seeking citizenship. So in light of the Ozawa case, which said that perception itself is not a good enough, whiteness of the skin itself is not a good enough test for deciding who is white, who classifies as white under the law, Thind argues that, well, as a high caste Indian, he qualified as Aryan, right? And therefore a Caucasian, classifying him as white under the law. So his argument is that, okay, while I might not pass the visual test, if we're going by some sort of kind of racist science version of whiteness is originating in the Caucasus, I count, right? And so, perhaps not a surprise to you, the court also rejected Thind's claims. And I'm interested in the reasons why. So the first, they kind of cherry pick the race science at the time and say, well, your type of Aryanness isn't what we meant by, this isn't the region through which whiteness emerges. And so that's just a really kind of cherry picked argument from whatever scientific literature at the time suited the court's liking. I'm more interested in the perceptual argument that they end up making against Thind. So the court declared in a unanimous opinion that race, quote, should be interpreted in accordance with the common man as, quote, a matter of familiar observation and knowledge based on, quote, physical group characteristics. Since Thind looked Indian in the eyes of common man, the court's logic went, he could not be white. The judges determined that, quote, racial difference is of such character and extent that the great body of our people instinctively recognize it. So just like the argument for pornography, the argument for race becomes the same thing, right? You know it when you see it. So whereas courts in the South, primarily policing the Black-white racial binary, used a strategy of blood knowledge to protect white privilege from mixed race persons, federal courts dealing with more global claims upon whiteness invoked a policy of you know it when you see it to disqualify those who might technically fit legal definitions of whiteness in terms of either blood or appearance, but whose classification as such threatened to open the category of whiteness far wider than was politically and socially palatable. Okay, so I'm going to bring it back to the skyscraper right now. But what the common man could, and these are all the terms that the Supreme Court used, what the common man could interpret, observe, know, or recognize by instinct, terms used by the Supreme Court to describe acts of racial discernment were marked by American writers as particularly fragile operations. Again, to go back to this image, within urban environments where buildings grew tenfold, seemingly overnight, boulevards hosted thickening masses, and sight lines were interrupted by bodies and buildings. Ozawa and Thinn's legal cases suggest the slipperiness of precise racial definitions regarding both blood and perception within even the most neutral of hypothetical environments, let alone in expanding cities where perception appeared perpetually strained. And so this is the context in which I'm really interested in the skyscraper becoming this kind of catalyst how in increasingly dense and vertical cities where vantage points and sight lines, right, are really changing what it means to have a normative understanding of perception. So the argument that I'm making, I am making an argument that's very distinct to this period after Reconstruction and the kinds of particular panics and anxieties, and for some kind of libertary possibilities that were emerging, given this unevenness and these kind of competing definitions of race. The skyscraper, comes of age amongst and plays a role in shaping, I argue. But the larger claim that I do want to make, the more general, I think, and the broader claim that I do want to make through this case study is to argue that we need to pay more attention to the ways that architecture more generally shapes and affects the ways we see and read race. I call for a more site-specific account of racial perception as a process framed and shaped by the built environment in which this perception takes place. And for me, this is a job not just for architectural historians, which I think until recently, there hasn't been a lot of attention to race and racial classification and racial histories in any vein within a lot of architectural historiography. But this is also, my call is also to critical race theorists and people who study race more broadly, that they also too need to be taking account of and thinking about the ways that the built environment is always shaping the material conditions through which racial perception happens, right? That racial perception happens in space, in volume, in messy environments, walking down the street, right? That critical race theory and people who are interested in the study of race more broadly, right, also need to be thinking about the built environment, the ways that it's always shaping the ways that people feel and think and claim to see and know and sense race. Okay, so that's the big overview. I have a few more minutes left, and maybe what I'll do in that time is just zoom in into one of the chapters to give you a sense of what's going on. A lot of what I just gave you is from the introduction, trying to set up the book and the propositions. And one of the middle chapters is titled Miscegenated Skyscrapers and Passing Metropolitans. And this is a chapter where I most explicitly engage with the writing of architects in particular, and the debates around architectural design and facade design, and really trying to think about the ways that those debates were supercharged with language coming from debates around race science, evolution, et cetera. So I'll talk about that for a second. So the impetus for this chapter, kind of key part of this chapter is this quote from Louis Sullivan. And I won't even describe who Sullivan is. I assume I don't have to do that work for this crowd. And this is from Kindergarten Chats, a text where a fictional teacher and a student of architecture have a long conversation about issues facing American architecture at the turn of the 20th century. But this is in a section titled An Oasis that praises H. Richardson's 13-story Marshall Field building completed in 1887. Sullivan's fictional stand-in the section explains to his student that, quote, in a world of barren pettiness, Richardson's building is a rare triumph, describing the structure as, quote, a real man, a manly man, a virile force that, quote, sings the song of procreant power as others have squealed of miscegenation. It's that term miscegenation that really struck me, trying to understand, well, what is Sullivan meaning when he invokes miscegenation, which has a very specific history within the US, which I'll talk about in just a second. It's a word that means what it means. And let me talk about what it means. He wasn't the only one to use this term. John Beverly Robinson also used the term in 1908 in a sketch in his book, Architectural Composition, where he describes this kind of top sketch as an image of what architectural miscegenation looks like, which is the mixing of two dissimilar parts, right, to create a miscegenated building. So for Sullivan and someone like Robinson searching for language with which to describe hopes for a nascent national architectural style, the discourse of miscegenation associated with impurity, infertility, perversity, and unnaturalness proved useful for critiquing a mongrel form of design that Sullivan in particular hoped to discourage. So let me talk a little bit about this term. So the word miscegenation was invented in 1863, so it's not that old when Sullivan himself is using it. It's invented in 1863 to name interracial sex as part of a political hoax. It was invented to scare voters by suggesting that the Republican Party not only encouraged miscegenation, but understood it as the bedrock of American democracy. So it was completely a hoax designed to kind of tar and feather the Republicans, putting out a pamphlet in their name. And so the invention of this term, it was designed to sound scientific. It combined the Latin words macere, to mix, and genus, kind. So this scientific sounding fabrication gave interracial sex, which was looming large in the national imagination, its first dedicated terminology. So before the invention of the term miscegenation, people would talk about interracial sex mostly using the term amalgamation, which was used to name all different types of mixtures and processes of hybridity. But with miscegenation, with this kind of hoax term that catches on, interracial sex gets its kind of first permanent dedicated vocabulary. So when Sullivan is using it, it never loses this charge. It never becomes purely analogy, right? And so while the originators of the term miscegenation intended it to narrowly describe acts of sexual reproduction between Blacks and whites in the 1860s, by the time of the skyscraper's invention, roughly 20 years later, the term was being used to describe a host of mixed up and undesirable material and social aesthetic forms emerging from or associated with interracial contact. So what's my point here? In this chapter, I'd really try to uncover the ways that architecture was one of many fields in this period interested in what new hybrid forms, reproductive, social, and aesthetic, might emerge from the expanding circuits of interracial intimacy within modernizing cities. And the skyscraper was perhaps at the center of this line of inquiry for American architects. The skyscraper was to be, I'm going to actually skip some of this because I talk a little bit about Homestead. I'll come back to this. I want to go to this Bar Ferry quote, which I'll read in a second. The skyscraper was to be the preeminent canvas for a budding American aesthetics. Which version of the United States and its citizenry should it reflect? Should it attempt to map America's own distinct racial heterogeneity, or seek more homogeneous stylistic precedents in European architecture or in an understanding of the natural world instead? So this is a quote from Bar Ferry from the first issue of an architectural record. A people composed of English, French, Germans, Italians, Spaniards, you get the point, I'll read the whole list, cannot assimilate such diverse elements without many years of intermixture and solidification. We have ideas that are representatively American. We have American customs and methods, none of which can be mistaken for anything else, but we have not that quality which will give us an architecture of our own, and that quality presumably being a racially homogeneous nation. Though architects and critics disagreed about which styles were best suited to the task of cladding the skyscraper, no matter what side of that debate they were on, they were all drawing from various versions of languages and theories of scientific racism, particularly suppositions about the dangers of sexual contact between incompatible racial types to justify their aesthetic programs. So I'm really building in this work from critics like and historians like Mabel Wilson, Joanna Merriweather Salisbury, Charles Davis, Philip Stedman, and Christina Cogdell to contextualize 19th century architectural discourse in relationship to the changing racial discourse that helped shape it. So I think about it through, something like Irving Pond's images, and the way they were kind of drawing from race science, but also thinking about Homestead and other steelworks, and the ways that the cheap steel that was used to make the skyscraper and made the skyscraper possible, right? That cheap steel really came from, in part, the successful efforts of steel manufacturers to prevent workers from unionizing. And that was largely through a concentrated effort to recruit a racially diverse workforce, banking that this interracial intimacy on the job would lead to antagonism rather than solidarity. By 1919, Homestead employed workers belonging to 54 different races and nationalities, making Western Pennsylvania one of the most ethnically and racially diverse regions in the country. So I don't actually talk a lot about this in the book because this kind of had to get cut from the book, but this question of the ways that race itself was mediating the production of steel, racial conflict within sites like Homestead and other steel sites, prevent steel as an industry from unionizing until 1937, which is so late. So you get almost 50 years of skyscraper built with steel that was produced with ununionized labor and effort rooted in careful tactics of racial management. So really, again, going back and thinking about the questions of racial mixture as they're shaping both the production of the skyscraper, the theory, the aesthetic theory of the skyscraper is part of what I try to do in this chapter. And in at least half of it. In the last half of the chapter, I'll quickly just show one more slide, then I'll stop sharing. I talk about Nella Larson, who was an American modernist writer who wrote this book called Passing, which had its own take on the ways that skyscraper architecture was shaping the possibilities for African Americans to secretly pass in urban cities. And she's interested, I argue, in this book in thinking about the ways that the skyscraper is again, putting stress upon the ability to have faith in one's own capacity to make a racial judgment. And really, I think, doing some really interesting, clever things with the built environment and the role that it plays in this anxiety in the 1920s around passing and interracial intimacy. Okay, so I think I'll stop there. I've talked enough. I'll stop sharing and maybe we could open it up for questions.
Thank you. That was a really wonderful, energetic and enthusiastic presentation of a perspective that you were absolutely right in our discipline of architectural history has been quite absent. I mean, indeed, absence is a word that you haven't said, but is kind of lies at the basis, the presence of the absence in the distance from the street or the density of the crowds on the sidewalk that you're suggesting gives the kind of anonymity of the modern city or the perspective of modernity on seeing the crowd. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about other cities that might not have skyscrapers, either in the South or smaller cities, or have Boston with a height control, or Washington, D.C., a problematic city in terms of race and its history, that doesn't have any skyscrapers because they are proscribed by a height limit. Are there any complications from considerations like that for your thesis?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Carol, and I'm sure that there are. I mean, my book it's called The Black Skyscraper, but, I will admit I'm interested in the skyscraper. I'm interested in the kind of conversation people are having specifically about the skyscraper. But, I'm really interested in, whether something is technically a skyscraper or not is less of my interest. And I'm more interested in the ways that height and density, whatever that height, whatever the cap is, right? If it's a kind of a change for the city that exists, right? I'm interested in that, in the ways that writers were responding to that. For Boston, I write a little bit about Boston when I'm writing about the realists. Like, you can't really write about like William Dean Howells and Henry James without thinking about Boston. And for James, when he's approaching the skyscraper and he's trying to write about it, For him, Boston is kind of the, an ideal city, right? And he keeps comparing New York to Boston into Ellis Island, which is interesting, right? For him, he's also a little bit shocked when he comes back to Boston, and he talks about the public library in Boston and about the ways that people are in everything and the kind of public access that that he associates as a difference between, let's say, American civic relationship to buildings and a European relationship to buildings, where people aren't in their in buildings, in civic buildings, or don't have access to civic buildings in the way they do in cities like Boston and New York. And for James, it's interesting, like he doesn't get freaked out by the density and the kind of levels of access within within civic structures within Boston. He talks about a loss of penetralia, which are like spaces for intimate and a way to break away from the crowd, but he's not overwhelmed by it in a city like Boston, where the scale allows him to actually continue to tell a story about people sharing space. Like, it's still overwhelming and a bit confusing, right? But it's still manageable and perceivable as a shared civic space. So for someone like James, he tries to bring that kind of generosity to New York. And at first, he's really charmed by the skyscraper and its possibilities, and both what it looks like and how it's kind of changed excitingly the city in the time that he's been gone. But ultimately, when he tries to actually narrate and describe what he sees from the skyscraper, or from a vantage point shaped by the density and the new sightlines produced by the skyscraper, he can't. Like, he talks about, like, I wish I had the full quote, I write about it in the book, right? But he talks about these kind of muddy streams of people. They're not even people, they're just kind of flashes and abstract paint strokes, right, on the street. And he can't narrate it. He can't find a way to bring it into narration. So there's something that's different for him about a place like New York, which really just challenges his ability to handle immigration, migration, the kind of interracial mixture that he can handle in a place like Boston. Even in Ellis Island, he finds a way to describe and narrate Ellis Island in a way that he finds kind of pleasing and acceptable. But there's something about the ways that the skyscraper makes people appear that makes it difficult for him, in particular in that city, right, to be able to find a vantage point in which he can manage racial difference and manage and bring together a kind of false but still kind of produced image of a kind of civic sphere that allows for something like narration itself to work. And so, this is not like a case that proves the rule at all, but it's just one example, I think, of the ways that for someone like Henry James in particular, New York really is, and there's something about the verticality and the vantage points that become available in New York, right, that truly do unsettle him in a way that places that aren't so vertically oriented, that aren't as tall, right, he can start to kind of try to imagine how to bring them into some sort of aesthetic scene of relationality.
The 1880s are so different than the 1920s. The 1920s as a decade has such an evolution towards the idea of modernity, maybe not so much in literature, but certainly in architecture, of kind of transformation through style, but through a particular recognition and relationship to Europe and the avant-garde. And so I wonder, how that the differences between modernity in different decades, or even different sources of modernity, or variations of thinking about the avant-garde, or simply, the adjusting to the present moment.
Absolutely, it's a great question, Carol. Yeah, I agree. Very different time periods, and so the book really starts in the late 19th century with realism and figures like Henry James and William Dean Howells, but also some of these really funky science fiction stories that are really trying to think about this question of what is going to happen to whiteness, the visual perception of whiteness in cities. The last chapter that I write is about the Jazz Age, so it is about the 20s, and so those are important bookmarks for me as well. And what I get interested in the 20s is this different focus on feeling and affect. So I write about The Great Gatsby, even though I said there's only one description of a skyscraper. It's still a book that really understands itself in relationship to vertical and horizontal vectors of space, and really trying to understand how those different vectors of space are really shaping the ways that race works in that book. The difference between Gatsby becoming Gatsby, which people have argued about the ways that Gatsby himself is a passing figure with hidden blood that doesn't become known until later in the book, and thinking about the ways that his race and other figures' race are navigated in the book, and the way that the built environment is shaping some of those questions about discernment and who counts and who doesn't count. And so I'm interested in I write about Gatsby. I write about this book that no one has read, but if you want, I think is the best novel of the skyscraper that has been of this period, which is Mary Borden's Flamingo. It's a book that is obsessed with, never heard of it, no one has. It's out of print. Mary Borden is a kind of interesting figure. She was a transatlantic modernist. She's most known for her war writing, but she ends up writing this book about this architect and this love affair around the skyscraper, this woman who loves this architect, and it is obsessed with the skyscraper. It's the only book that I know of from this period that where every page you get a description of the skyscraper. But she's really interested in thinking about the Jazz Age and the ways that Blackness in particular becomes a kind of savior for white writers, as a way to think about how to not be swallowed up by the skyscraper, right? Because the Jazz Age is also the period of the height of an interest in primitivism, right? Where this understanding of Black bodies as more joyful, as free from modernity, whereas white subjects were being crushed by modernity, right? This was a kind of popular understanding of Blackness in the 20s. And I compare that novel with the ways that Le Corbusier writes about Harlem and When the Cathedrals Were White, to think about the different ways they're interested in energizing and enervating Blackness that can in some ways withstand the kind of soul-crushing pressures of being swallowed day in and day out and made to feel anonymous in the city, where you're kind of towered over by the built environment and meant to feel like a speck and an ant, right? So this feeling of how is whiteness supposed to feel, which is such a big question for the Jazz Age, right? And for white metropolitans who are writing about whiteness and race within the Jazz Age. And I also, in the second half of that chapter, I write about Faith Baldwin, who's actually the best-selling author, one of the best-selling authors of the Great Depression, who wrote romance novels, largely for and about white working women who worked in the skyscraper. And so there's a sense of romance and excitement that comes with working in the skyscraper, but also in those books, there's a sense of, well, what happens with white working women within the skyscraper become too enamored with the skyscraper environment, and they don't reproduce. So this kind of hauntingness of eugenics also shapes her novels, right? Where it's like, okay, these women really love to work, and all this romance is happening in the skyscraper, but there's ultimately a danger. And most of the novels end with the women giving up their careers and going back home, and the kind of questions of race and eugenics haunt her novels in really interesting ways. And the skyscraper plays a particular presence in those books as a foil, as a character, as a love interest. So yeah, the 20s for me is really about how to kind of conquer feeling, and the ways that the skyscraper is producing kind of disrupting this question of self-sovereignty that was so key to the understanding of what whiteness was and what made it distinct, and allowed it to kind of do its work in the 19th century in relationship to settler colonialism in the US and transnationally.
So we're close to the end of our time, and since we did have this earlier conversation about William Sterrett, the builder of Sterrett Brothers and Eakin, and you mentioned an essay that has just recently been published, I wonder if you could, well, tell us a little bit more about that, but also discuss professional literature like the Sterrett book, and how that is different than the fictional world, or the more kind of interpretive or kind of projection of emotions rather than description of facts that is so key to the very voluminous professional literature of the time about the skyscraper.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I actually, in my book, I really this is kind of my method in general. I'm interested in narrative. So I don't so much discriminate between the literary and the non-literary. I'm interested in the ways that people try to put into description, the ways that they see, and the kind of forms of perception they have in relationship to the skyscraper. So something like Skyscrapers and the Men Who Build Them has been a kind of key text for this project from the beginning, because it's so, let's call it, for the sake of today, let's call it literary, right? Like so much of that, the second half, like a lot of the later chapters are very technical, and he's really describing in great detail how things work, where they go, how he's doing this coordination. There's also such great feeling in that book where he's describing his family, and he's talking about the different kinds of tribes that produce skyscraper. And he's really trying to make an aesthetic argument for the work of the builder, right? Like to say, like, the builder is producing beauty too. We produce beauty in the ways that we choreograph this labor, right? And the ways that we are able to manage this work site, right? Like he's almost talking about it as if he's a choreographer, right? So this is the way that I kind of get really interested and stare at that. There are these moments of really dry and technical details, but in the middle of those details, you'll get a flash of something that's really quite poetic, where he's really trying to describe what it means to see a worker, right? Or how the worker appears in a field of other workers, right? He's giving you this kind of insight into how he's thinking about aesthetics and perception, and making the case for the art for the skyscraper. And so, this is true of the kind of the work that I read, which is, for me, it's pretty common to read a novel next to, an architectural treatise, because I'm interested in the same thing in both, right? The ways that people are trying to describe and bring into, to find a way to narrate their experience of the skyscraper, and to bring into language the ways that they're having trouble producing discernment or having trouble producing narratives, right? Like it's that kind of tripped up language that I get really interested in, whether it's in, architectural record, or whether it's in Stare, or whether it's in like, F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Mm-hmm. And what about architectural criticism? There are a couple of questions which I'll look at as you try to answer that. I have to say, I will confess, one of my least favorite critics of the period is Montgomery Schuyler, who has extraordinarily florid language.
Yes.
So, he tries too hard in order to elevate his subject to my taste, but he is typical in some ways of the writing of the end of the 19th century.
Yes. Yeah. I read a lot of Montgomery Schuyler. I read basically I tried to read, if not cover to cover, then really pay attention to where the skyscraper is emerging in, the big and the small architectural journals in the period that I'm writing about. So obviously something like Architectural Record, Inland Architect, and really trying to, and others, to pay attention to, again, to get that sense of prose and feeling and excitement. I had a lot, I thought Schuyler was going to be a bigger player in this book. Maybe I also subconsciously, now that you say it, Carol, felt the same way that you felt about him. There's a lot to slog through with Schuyler, but, I'm interested, to be able to tell this story, I felt like I had to do my due diligence, right? I had to understand and really do the best that I could to really inhabit the ways that architects were talking to each other and talking to their publics, however those were construed, and really trying to get a sense and an ear for these debates around, around skyscraper facade, around style, right, around American architecture more broadly, right, and it's, those were the most fun chapters for me to that was the most fun work, because that's where I got to kind of do something different, bring my literary hat, where I'm paying attention to words and really being attentive to the words on the page and how things are said, and trying to understand something about the experience of the skyscraper and the influence on, the kind of ways that race science, which is also crazy field to read in, right, and horrific for its own reasons, but to start to notice the patterns and the kinds of languages and shared terms and phrases and terminology, and to realize that this is actually a much broader conversation, right, that the architects were reading the scientific racism, the scientific racists were reading, they were all kind of sharing a kind of learned public sphere. And so in some ways, trying to kind of put together that story that I think tends to be not treated in that way, was it was like the part of the research where I felt like I was learning a lot and like feel like I was really trying to understand the discourse of the day and make these connections that maybe hadn't been fully all the way made before.
We do have a question about the issue of labor. So maybe by way of concluding, labor history is indeed a place where that interface between your reading and a much more established body of history literature has examined issues of ethnicity and race. So I wonder if you might comment on that. I guess the person is asking, could you talk a little bit more about the visual representation of workers and constructed who also constructed the skyscrapers, but let's put that together with, the kind of disciplinary focus on issues of labor.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I nod a little bit, I just talked a little bit about Homestead, and I got so swept up in the story of steel and unionization and labor. It ends up being a sentence in the book, but really it was about 4 months of research, as it usually goes. As I'm sure you know, Carol, many in the room know, right? Like you get down a rabbit hole, and then you realize, oh, I think I only care about this, or I don't know how to make everyone care about this. So it had to kind of get cut. And so, I got really interested in labor history and would love to kind of keep thinking about it, because you're right, like it is a place where the questions of race, they can't be invisibilized, especially for something like steel, right? Because it really is the apparatus that delays, a key apparatus that successfully delays unionization, allows for steel to be so cheap for so long. It really does impact the story of the skyscraper. In terms of the workers, that was another thing that a whole chapter that was in the dissertation, which I left out of the book, but luckily has now been published as part of a new volume called Race in Modern Architecture, edited by Mabel Wilson, Charles Davis, and Irene Chang. And there I really talk a lot more about Sterrett and the way he's thinking about race on the work site, and compare the ways that Sterrett's kind of more, he's interested in kind of colorblind version of the skyscraper work site, which is very different than the kind of accounts that were coming out in Harper's and other kind of newspapers and magazines in the period that were much more interested in spectacularizing the dangers of skyscraper construction, but also in terms of spectacularizing the bodies of the workers and really holding up the beam walker in particular as this kind of idealized figure, erasing the native workers, the largely Mohawk workers who also were beam walkers, but also erases, the Italians and the Blacks who were largely confined to working in the digging the foundations. And so really trying to kind of tell the story that recapture the story of the skyscraper as a kind of visible work site. I talk about as what I think to be the most visible kind of mass work site within the city. The only place I think that would compete with it would be the docks, right? Where you could go and see, thousands of men working at one time, and what kind of a spectacle that was. It makes for good copy, right? So it's not a surprise that so many journalists were drawn to that story, but also were drawn to kind of sensationalizing the visibility of the racial detail. Sterrett takes a very different tactic, and I think he understands that he is the star of the story. The whole point of skyscrapers and the men who build them is that he is the men who build them, right? He and his brothers and his family, right? So he has a different stake in de-spectacularizing the labor of skyscraper construction. So his work, can shine. And race, when he talks about race, it's really interesting. Like the ways that the detail emerges and comes in and comes out of his narration is really fascinating. So I write about that a bit in this essay, which I'm really glad made it somewhere since it didn't make it into the book.
Well, I look forward to catching up to that one. And because we really are now beginning to get well over our time, I want to thank you so much for tonight for broadening our horizons on this topic. Certainly, skyscrapers are to my mind, one of the most fruitful ways to understand the impact of the modern city on a broad populace that has really left out the issue of race for far too long in the history. So you've broadened our perspective tonight, and I hope we'll get everybody to tune into your work so that we can both appreciate it and also expand it as you do as you're launching what is going to be a rich and long career as a scholar. So it's really a delight to have all your enthusiasm and your knowledge and your perspective tonight. So thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again sometime. And next time you're at the museum, absolutely, you will be my guest, and I hope everybody will soon be returning to the museum when I think public hours sometime in late June or early July means we'll be able to open up again, as we all look forward to enjoying the modern city in all of its dimensions. So thanks, Adrienne, and thanks everybody for being with us tonight. Tune in 2 weeks for Elizabeth Macaulay Lewis and Antiquity in Gotham for something quite different. So we'll see you as classicism returns to the modern city, a little bit more retrograde than our topics for tonight, but it's the many dimensions of New York that we'll continue to explore. So thanks, Adrienne, again, and night, everybody. Okay, welcome everybody. It's 6 o'clock on a beautiful early summer, I guess we'd have to say, evening in New York. And we appreciate all of you who have shown up for this live webinar. As you know, all of our programs are put onto video and onto our website, where you can see them for a second time, or louder or more closely. But we're particularly happy that you could join us live tonight for this first of actually it was the second of our May book talks. This evening by Adrienne Brown, who is a professor at the University of Chicago, who about 3 years ago now published The Black Skyscraper: Architecture and the Perception of Race. And has worked in this area of race and real estate, race and architecture through the lens of English literature, or let's say American literature, but the discipline of English. She is, as I mentioned, a professor at the University of Chicago and directs a number of, teaches in a number of areas, and directs a program now no longer as the Director of Undergraduate Studies, but a Center for Arts and Public Life that tries to bring together interdisciplinary work from across a lot of departments and a lot of interests, and also through kind of popular culture and public space. So that subject is something she has explored in this historical study that's framed around the Black Skyscraper, a lens looking at architecture through literature, through all aspects of the arts, bringing that kind of perspective to a study of kind of the great American invention, as well as the great American novel, of the tall building in the city, especially in New York and Chicago, the kind of icon of modernity that develops from the late 19th century and through the 1920s, which is the period that she frames in her book. So this is a study that complements some of the other essays that she has recently authored, including one I was just chatting with her about, which is from a collection called Race and Modern Architecture, and focuses in particular on William Sterrett, who she will talk a little bit about tonight, one of the 5 Sterrett brothers, and one of the partners in Sterrett Brothers and Eakin, who built the Empire State Building, among other key buildings, and indeed the one that you see on the cover of her book, 40 Wall Street, they were also the general contractor for, and a kind of fascinating perspective that she is bringing to the subject and the personalities who were so key in the making of the kind of logic of the high-rise buildings and the new landscape of modernity that was the skyscraper city and skyline of New York, as well as of Chicago. But this is a lens that that not many people have focused before on in the history of the skyscraper. And so I'm particularly happy that we've finally gotten around to inviting Adrienne to speak in kind of longer format tonight about her book. So I will just mention that she did her undergraduate work at the University of Maryland. She did her PhD at Princeton in the Department of English, and that we are very delighted to invite her onto the screen now, share her screen, and bring she's already previewed as a very dynamic presentation that's going to touch on all kinds of skyscrapers and city views, especially in Chicago, but also through books and literature and the arts of the city in a period where the skyscraper's modernity and America's modernity is really taking shape. So Adrienne, I will get off the screen now and hand it over to you, and thank you again for being here.